Afternoon to all. Can you hear me okay with this mic just on here like that? Do I have to wear it? It's okay. Okay, good. Well, thank you. I'm back for a little longer talk now. Thanks for taking the time to watch the trailer a few minutes ago. Let me tell you just a little bit more about this work in evangelization that I'm doing. I've been a professor here for the past many years, but about 4 years ago, Cardinal George stopped me and said, I'd like you to work on the evangelization of the culture. And we've been kind of exploring what exactly that means the past many years. And I mentioned I've been doing work with DVDs and media. I've put about 60 little commentaries on YouTube talking about books and culture and what's going on in the news and so on. Then the 10-part series is part of that. But you know where a lot of this came from? Was actually John Paul II. Going back about 10 years ago, Cardinal George went to Rome for the Ad Limina visit. He laid out all the statistics and so on about the diocese. The Pope listened very attentively. But then at the end of the meeting, John Paul II said to Cardinal George, what are you doing to evangelize the culture? And the Cardinal said he was a bit taken aback, though he knew that question was very important for John Paul II, but he didn't have a nice, pithy answer to that question. And he said it began to gnaw at him. It began to bother him. And I do think his interest in this area was very much born of John Paul II's concern. What are we doing to evangelize the culture? And I think that is a very pressing question for our time. Well, how do we explore it? I would suggest looking at St. Paul. And we're coming now toward the end of the year of St. Paul. So one more time to stop and look at Paul. How come? Well, Hans Urs von Balthasar, the favorite theologian of both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, said this: there are three great archetypes of Christian life. There's the Johannine archetype, the Petrine archetype, and the Pauline archetype. What's the Johannine? The one that comes up out of John the Apostle, John the Evangelist. This is the role of prayer, mysticism, contemplation, liturgy, monasticism in the life of the church. Think of John resting on the breast of the Lord, listening to his heart, aligning his vision to the vision of Christ. Well, that's an archetype of the life of prayer and mysticism and spirituality. There's also, Balthasar said, the Petrine archetype. That's the archetype that comes out of Peter. And it means leadership, governance, those who direct the mission of the church. There are probably many in this room who are Petrine in their mission. They're governing, directing the charisms in the church. But thirdly, Balthasar said, there is the Pauline archetype, that which comes up out of St. Paul. What's this? Teaching, preaching, evangelizing, announcing the word, and engaging the culture. Think of Paul now going out to the various cultures and languages of his time and announcing the word of Jesus Christ. Think of Paul engaging, sometimes peacefully, sometimes meeting an awful lot of opposition, but engaging the cultures. That's the Pauline form. It's very much, I think of my own role in the church is very much Pauline. Most of my life has been as a teacher, preacher, evangelist. I'm very interested in the questions of culture, how the faith impinges upon the culture. So I think for all of us, and everybody in this room to some degree is Pauline, we're all interested in evangelization. There's no better place to look than Paul. So what I'm going to do in this brief talk is to look a bit at Paul's life and times, then at some essential moves in his theology, and then I want to draw just a few simple evangelistic conclusions from that. Okay? So that's the program if you're keeping score. First of all, Paul, his life and times. Who was he? Who was this figure? He's born, of course, Saul, Shaul in the Hebrew, sometime around the year 10. You might say the year 9, and that's one reason Pope Benedict made this the year of Paul. It was the 2000th anniversary of his birth. So he's a younger contemporary of Jesus and the apostles. He's from Tarsus, as we know, in southeastern Turkey, present-day location. Shaul's parents were Jews of the diaspora. And so young Shaul, young Saul, comes of age in a Hellenistic culture, Greek, as a Roman citizen, and, above all, as a son of Israel. He combined in his person the three great cultures of that time and place, Hellenistic, Roman, and Jewish, which made him, of course, a very apt vessel for the work of carrying the gospel to the nations. We think he probably received a pretty good classical education. Young Shaul was probably formed in the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, almost certainly in the great Greek poet Homer. He knew that Greek literary tradition. But, above all, he became a student of the Hebrew Scriptures. We know from his own testimony that as a young man, he went to Jerusalem to study at the feet of Gamaliel, who was one of the leading rabbis of the time. Probably the best analogy to our own situation would be a promising young seminarian being sent to Rome or being sent, for advanced studies. Well, that was young Shaul, this kid from the diaspora, this kid from the provinces, but now sent to the heart of Judaism in Jerusalem. What was his life there? Well, conjure up now in your imagination that scene of Jesus among the doctors in the temple. Jesus asking and answering questions. That would have been the world of young Saul, living among the great teachers, scribes, writers in the temple. The liturgical and intellectual life of the temple, being immersed in the world and story of Israel, that would have been the world of young Saul. Now we know from other sources that Gamaliel, Saul's teacher, advocated a more moderate, kind of liberal form of Judaism. But young Saul, it seems, went in a different direction. He went in a much more radical, much more extreme direction, becoming, as he put it, zealous for the traditions of our fathers, zealous for classical Israel. The young, fanatic, religious zealot, we know the type today only too well. I mean, you can see the face of young Saul, I think, as you look into the faces of some of those very violent, extreme religious zealots today. What bugged this young man, zealous for the traditions of his fathers? Above all, this nascent Christian movement. And how couldn't it have bugged him? The claim that a Nazarene carpenter who had been crucified by the Romans was the Mashiach of Israel went counter to everything Saul knew about the traditions of his people and the expectations of the Messiah. One of the things, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, one of the things they saw was the Mashiach, the Anointed One, would deal with the enemies of Israel and would reign as Lord of the nations. So, you're telling me somebody whom the Romans put to death, who was killed by the enemies of Israel, is the Mashiach? You've got to be kidding. And that's precisely why young Saul goes after the young church with such vehemence. So we hear now in the Acts of the Apostles. The first references to Saul, of course, are in the Acts of the Apostles. What do we find? That he is breathing murderous threats, seeking out Christians, even dragging them from their homes. What is it about that image that haunts us? I mean, it's so vivid, isn't it? Here's this young fanatic going in and literally dragging people from their homes to persecute them. We hear, of course, that Saul presides at the stoning of Stephen. While they put Stephen to death, they lay their cloaks at the feet of Saul. It's as though he's presiding over the scene. Pretty negative picture, isn't it, that we get? The first image of Saul. He then gets permission to go as far as Damascus. Pretty good trip for those days. It was a pretty good road trip. to pursue Christians. On his way, something happened. What was it? What was it? Well, of course, Saul was so impressed by it that 3 times we find descriptions of it in the Acts and in his own writings. This event must have so overwhelmed him, so preoccupied him. Here's one description of it. On his journey, as he was nearing Damascus, a light from the sky suddenly flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Shaul, Shaul, why are you persecuting me?" When Saul inquires as to the identity of the speaker, he hears, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up, go into the city. You'll be told what to do." To say that this encounter with the risen Christ changed Saul would be the understatement of the millennium. You know, many years ago, I read a book that was the 100 most influential people of all time. It listed Jesus as 3rd, Muhammad as 2nd, Paul 1st. I don't know if I agree with that, but there's something to it. It was from this encounter that the power emerged. Saul was baptized. We hear that something like scales fell from his eyes. Beautifully evocative, isn't it? Of that blindness and vision that comes through this process. He begins, much to the consternation of the Christians, to announce Jesus. I say to their consternation because it was so shocking. They were convinced he was a spy. This is the one that's been persecuting us, and now he's preaching. He must be trying to worm his way into our circle. They were scandalized by him. We hear this then. Paul says it in his own letters. After the experience, he went to Arabia and then back to Damascus. And finally, after 3 years, he went to Jerusalem to consult with the other apostles. Does it sound a little bit confused to you? I think it's not accidental. What was he doing? I think he was trying to understand what in the world happened to him. He's persecuting Christ and his church, but Christ himself speaks to him. You don't just take that in and set off on a new path immediately. I think what he was doing was, he was trying now to reconfigure everything he knew about Judaism, everything he knew about Israel, around this figure of Jesus. You know, as many point out, it's wrong to speak really of the conversion of Saul as though he passed from one religion to another. He saw instead the fulfillment of his Judaism. He saw himself as an Israelite. He never stopped being an Israelite. But now he took everything he knew about Israel and related it to this Jesus. I'll come back to this. But Jesus was the fulfillment of everything he knew about Israel. And I think that was probably the work of those 3 years, as he's trying to fit this all together. I love the detail that it was Barnabas who finally came to Tarsus to get him. How often that's the case in the spiritual life, isn't it? As we're trying to get it together, somebody else recognizes, well, that's your mission. Someone else comes and names it and gets you. So Barnabas brings Saul back into the picture. And then, of course, we see his great missionary work. And he's the archetype of all Christian missionaries. What did he want to do? He wanted to go to the ends of the world. When Paul says, I want to go to Spain to announce the gospel, that's his version of Timbuktu. You know, when they say in the Old Testament, they talk about Tarshish. Tarshish means that ends of the earth. It means that the Pillars of Hercules in Spain. That's as far as Paul wanted to go to announce what? That a new king of Israel had emerged, and therefore the new king of the world. I'll come back to that too. That's at the heart of his evangelization. There's a new king. We know, of course, he went as far as Rome. He didn't make it to Spain. He's killed sometime during the Nero persecution, same time that St. Peter was killed. Paul, though, was given the easier way out because he was a citizen of Rome. He was beheaded. And his tomb most likely is there at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. There was just very recently excavations done there. Okay. It's a sketch of Paul's life and times. Now, what about his theology? What was Paul's great message? First, I will say this. Paul's first great message was resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead was the essential, central teaching of Paul. You know that wonderful scene recounted in the Acts of the Apostles when Paul comes into the Areopagus in Athens, the great public square, where all the points of view were on display. Everything was being sold in the economic and intellectual sense. It was all there. I say, by the way, I think YouTube today is the virtual Areopagus. If you want to see a place where every point of view is on display, that's it. Well, Paul walks into that place. What does he say? Over and again, he says, anastasis, 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 resurrection. He said it so often, people were convinced he was announcing a new God by that name. No, what he was announcing was the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Now, mind you, most people we hear laughed at him or walked away. That's a very important message now for us evangelists. It's not always the immediate success that matters. You know, they all walked away from Paul, it says, except a few. Watch those few that listen. They can make all the difference. Mind you that Paul in his letters says very little about the teaching of Jesus. That comes later with the Gospels. But the Pauline epistles say almost nothing about the teaching of Jesus. Almost nothing about his miracles. Almost nothing about his public life. But he speaks over and over again about the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. That's his message. Now, what did he mean by it? Go to the work now of N.T. Wright, the Anglican Bishop of Durham, but wrote a wonderful book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's a very good rehearsal of the views on display in the first century about what happens after we die. And Paul would have known all these. Take the Sadducees, for example. They would have held, like a lot of the ancient Jews, that nothing happens after you die. You die and you go into the ground and you fade away. There is no resurrection or afterlife of any kind. Others said, no, the souls of the just are in the hand of God. Remember that line from the Book of Wisdom. So the souls of the just and the martyrs go to be with God. It's not all that far really from the Greek view, Plato's view, that at death the soul escapes from the body and goes to a spiritual realm. Many Jews would have believed that